My boss had recently decided to reduce my working hours, and that's it. I could no longer cover the rent, but I didn't want to leave my apartment either, so I thought it would be best to get a roommate. The first person that came to mind was my cousin Brittany. Well, when we last spoke, she kept going on about how complicated her roommate was, so I figured she'd be happy to move in with me. I called her to propose it, but she didn't answer, so I sent her a message. Britt has always been less direct and preferred to write instead of talking on the phone, so I told her that I was looking for someone to share the space as soon as possible, but it would have to be a secret deal, as my landlord wouldn't let me add another name to the contract. Unfortunately, Brittany wasn't interested, as she had recently moved. This disappointed me a little because I needed someone I could trust, and she was perfect. But then, Britt recommended her friend Chloe to me. I hadn't seen Chloe in years. I'd only exchanged a few words with her when I was in primary school. But my cousin said she was ideal for the situation. I decided to call her that same day, and unlike Brittany, Chloe answered right away. Her tone was very friendly, and she gave me good vibes right away, and fortunately, she agreed to move in and pay me half the rent directly. She even offered to help with the utility bills, something I hadn't even mentioned. How could I refuse that? We met the next day for coffee, and suddenly, our little chat turned into a conversation that lasted more than 2 hours. It was so easy to talk to her that I felt like we had known each other all our lives. We made a verbal deal that afternoon, and she moved in the next day. At first, everything was going great. Chloe made dinner and even cleaned the flat. She said she wanted to be the best roomie ever. But after a week, I started to notice some strange things. One day, I came home late from work and fell asleep on the sofa, and in the middle of the night, I woke up to find Chloe standing over me, slowly running her hands through my hair. I was shocked, and without realizing it, I moved abruptly, which caused me to pull out a good section of my hair. Chloe apologized immediately, explaining that she had seen my hair fall down my arm and that she wanted to help me untangle it. I told her that it didn't matter, but that it wasn't right, something she understood and promised she wouldn't do again. But that wasn't all, as strange situations continued to occur. Sometimes I would find her looking out of the window as if she were waiting for something. Other times I would come home to find her room dark, even though it had been sunny all day. As the days went by, I felt increasingly uncomfortable, and I didn't know if I had made the right decision in inviting her to live with me. After a few weeks, the atmosphere in the apartment began to change, and I couldn't help but wonder what was really going on. After the hair thing, things got really weird. Chloe started borrowing my clothes without asking, and one day she came into my room and stood there at the foot of my bed, staring at me. Not only that, but she also turned up one day with an iguana as a pet, without warning me first. So I had to go back to the shop because I wasn't prepared to have a reptile at home. But the most disturbing thing wasn't the things she did, but the way she looked at me, as if she was always afraid of being caught doing something wrong. I started to feel a knot in my stomach every time I thought of her. I tried to talk to Brittany several times during those weeks. I sent her messages and told her how strange Chloe was, but she always defended her friend, saying that I was exaggerating. However, things became even more disturbing in the days that followed. One day I came home and found her standing in my room, sniffing my clothes, and when she saw me, she acted naturally, as if it were nothing. That was the last straw. I had reached the point where I couldn't stay any longer, so without saying a word, I rushed out of the apartment and went straight to Brittany's house. I had to ask her why she had recommended someone as strange as Chloe to me. When I arrived, I noticed that the front door was ajar, so I looked inside, and to my surprise, there were 2 police cars parked outside. That puzzled me a bit. What were the police doing at my cousin's house? I also noticed that there was yellow tape cordoning off the place. At that moment, my heart began to beat very fast, and I decided to go into the house. As I did so, I saw that there was a policeman searching the room, and I could see patches of dried blood all over the place, with small numbered cards next to each stain. It was a crime scene. At that moment, I realized that Britt was nowhere to be seen, and that scared me, so I wanted to go in to look for her. But the policeman stopped me at the door, asking me to leave the premises. But I explained to him that Brittany was my cousin and that she lived there. I also told him that I needed to talk to her to find out what had happened. But then the officer looked at me seriously and said something devastating. He informed me that Brittany was, in fact, the victim. It turned out that she had been dead for weeks and no one had noticed because someone had taken her phone and pretended to be her. The only reason the police had arrived was because a neighbor had complained about the bad smell. At that moment, my body went weak, my knees buckled, and the policeman had to hold me up so I didn't fall. But beyond the shock of the terrible news, there was only one question floating around in my mind. If my cousin had been dead for so long, that only meant that she hadn't been the one who recommended me to Chloe, therefore it was obvious that Chloe had stolen her phone, and what that implied, it simply my blood ran cold. When I managed to catch my breath, I told the policeman about Chloe and my suspicions about her, and after a brief exchange, he offered to take me to the station to give my statement, but I preferred to go on my own, and he agreed, which made me feel a little more confident that I was not a suspect. Before leaving, I decided to wait at the house while the other policeman was still inside, so I stood by the door and called Chloe. I tried to sound casual as I told her I was going to stop by Britt's house for a surprise visit, and when I asked her about it, she fell silent. She couldn't come up with a good excuse, I guess, because I took her by surprise. Finally, she said, "Wait for me, I want to see her too," and she hung up. 5 minutes later, I saw her park her car near mine and approach. "You haven't heard yet, have you?" I asked her. "Heard what?" she said with a falseness that was noticeable from miles away. "She was murdered. I just found out," I said, and she responded with a look of surprise that didn't convince me in the least. At that moment, I felt rage overflowing, so I approached her slowly, not hiding my "I know you did it" face, and looked her straight in the eye. I couldn't believe she dared to act that way. Then I asked her if she was planning to kill me too, like she had done to Brittany. She shifted a little, looking around as if she couldn't see the cop right behind the window, and with a mocking and very malicious expression, she whispered to me, "Of course, that's just what I was planning to do." That was all the confession I needed, but she went on talking, smugly explaining that she always found roommates, got into their lives, and then killed them and took their identity. She spoke as if it were normal, routine for her. It sounded completely ridiculous, but clearly she had been doing it for a long time and until now without getting caught. Then she looked at me and said, "You are no longer of any use to me." At that moment, she took a knife out of her pocket and lunged at me, but I ran into the house, and just as she was about to attack me, she realized that the policeman was only a few steps behind me, pointing his gun at her. It was an incredible moment of judgment. The officer demanded that she drop the knife, but she refused, so he knocked her to the ground and took it from her. I saw her leave the house in handcuffs and felt some relief knowing that justice had been done for Britt. Her madness ended there finally, but my heart was still racing, with a mixture of relief and fear, wondering how many more like Chloe were out there and how close I had been to being the next victim. My name is Martin. I used to be a super normal guy, but what happened to me recently changed my life forever. Before I tell you, let me give you a little background. When I was a kid, I was kidnapped after school by some guys who wanted to hold my parents to ransom. In desperation, they went into debt up to their necks to free me, and the police didn't find out anything because my captors threatened to kill me if they reported it. Now 30 years have passed since that terrible day, and as soon as I came of age, I left that town. I didn't even want to hear about everything that had happened, but you know what? I recently decided to go back. I had to face my fears, and besides, I wanted to see my parents again. I was also dying to meet my brother and my nephew, whom I had never seen. However, once I returned, everything came rushing back, hitting me like a train at full speed. The dark memories, the abandoned factory where they locked me up, the road where they put me in that huge white van. It was like a nightmare I had forgotten, but now it felt real again. When I got home, I settled into what had been my room since I was a child and tried to adapt to village life again. I knew it was going to be difficult, but I managed not to overthink what had happened. Instead, I focused on spending time with my family, and my nephew got to know me. During those days, I felt happy, but there was something in the air that worried me. Shortly after, I was watching the news and heard that some children in the village had been kidnapped from the community, and my heart stopped when I heard that my nephew was among them. My brother hadn't mentioned anything yet, probably so as not to frighten our parents, who were already old, but panic took hold of me. I turned off the TV so I could think clearly and assimilate what I had just heard, but I couldn't escape my phone, which started ringing in a terrifying way. "Hello, turning off the TV isn't going to stop the children from disappearing, Martin," said the voice on the other end calmly. "Who are you? How do you know my name?" I said, starting to sweat coldly. "Oh, come on, don't play dumb, you recognize my voice." It was then that I recognized it. It was him, my kidnapper. "How do you know it's me? How did you know I was watching TV? Why are you doing this? Nobody in my family has any money. We lost everything because of you." I began to speak, feeling the air getting stuck in my lungs, and I started to hyperventilate. "Make no mistake, we didn't kidnap you for money. There is a score to settle, and if you don't do as we ask, those children, including your nephew, will die, so only you can help them. You know the score, you know where we are, and what will happen if you call the police." Without another word, the guy hung up. I fell to the floor, trembling and drained of energy, crying and feeling my throat closing up. It wasn't something new. I was having a panic attack. Something I had been fighting since I was a child, since I got out of the clutches of that monster who now had my nephew. All this was happening to me again, and this time it was personal. After a moment of shock, I decided I had to act. I went to my truck, but this time I wouldn't make the same mistake as before. I quickly wrote a note to my parents asking them to call the police. I had to do something, and that was the only way I had a chance. I couldn't let my nephew suffer what I had gone through, so it was time to face my ghosts and do what I had to do to save them. I didn't want to risk calling because I didn't know if this person had tapped my phone or if they were watching me all the time. What made me feel that way was that they were aware of everything I was doing. So I accelerated my car and drove to the only place I could think of where the children might be, the old warehouse. When I arrived, I grabbed a kitchen knife that I had hidden before leaving and went inside. The moment I set foot inside, my cell phone rang again. I answered, ready to tell them that I had called the police, but then the call was interrupted by a huge guy who grabbed me by the shoulder. As I turned around, I realized it was him, the same monster who had kidnapped me as a child, but now he had a terrifying mask and his body was covered with a gigantic jacket. Even though he was in disguise, I recognized him instantly. I wasn't wrong. I only had to look at his figure and listen to his voice for all the terrible memories of my childhood to come flooding back to me. This man was my kidnapper, there was no doubt about it. Without thinking, he gave me a brutal blow that knocked me down. The children who were gagged tried to scream, but their terror was palpable, and they could do nothing but cry out in fear while the giant continued to beat me mercilessly. I tried to pull out my knife to defend myself, but he easily took it from my hand, as if he were taking a toy from a child. I was no match for him, I knew it, so I didn't defend myself. I just tried to cover up to dodge the blows, but it didn't do much good. "You can't rescue them, Matten. Your nephew is dead. They're all dead. When I'm done with you, I'll show you each of their bodies and you'll know it's all your fault," he said with a crooked smile that made my blood run cold. At that moment, with the only impulse I had left, I tried to get up to get to the children, willing to sacrifice everything for them, but then suddenly the warehouse door flew open, and I saw a group of policemen come in, armed and shouting to free the children. But something wasn't right. They were pointing their guns at me. Frightened, I raised my hands and the kidnapper vanished immediately. When I raised my hands, I noticed that I still had the knife he had taken from me a moment ago. I was very confused, but I didn't have time to think about anything, because the policeman ran towards me, and in an outburst of instinct, I threw the knife as far as I could and raised my hands again. That night, they arrested me and released the children. I wasn't afraid, because I thought that when they started investigating, they would finally declare me innocent because I hadn't done anything. On the contrary, I was as much a victim as this. But instead, I was accused of kidnapping and other crimes. I was baffled. Why? If it was those guys who had threatened me and kidnapped the children. Besides, I was the one who called the police. I didn't know it, but I was found guilty, and instead of prison, they took me to a mental health center. The psychiatrist always said that what I did was the result of not being able to close the trauma of my childhood. He explained that the kidnapper was in my head and that I could never separate from him. His influence was so strong that my mind had been split in two, one part yearning for peace and the other tormented by the memory. The therapist kept telling me that I'd been so traumatized and frightened because they never found the real kidnapper that, in a way, I had to create my own closure. I decided that one way or another, I was going to face that monster even if he wasn't real. He also told me that none of those calls had taken place. There were no records either on the home phone or on my cell phone. Since I entered the psychiatric hospital, everything has become a little clearer. I have worked on my traumas and everyone says that I am on the road to recovery, but deep down I know that this is not the case. Part of me is convinced that what I experienced was real, and that part is sure that one day it will prove to everyone that the kidnapper is still at large, and that they will see that they will not get rid of him. I never imagined that a scent could have such an impact on my life, as if it awakened something primordial within me. But that happened when I switched to a natural deodorant. When I decided to change to a healthier life, free of chemicals and processed products, both in my diet and in my personal care, I felt a different connection, a kind of liberation. It was raw, untamable, without regrets. That smell was not just a scent, it was a statement, a way of taking control of who I am and leaving behind the chains of society. But Emma, my fiancée, couldn't understand this. One night, as I stood across the room from her, her voice trembled as she said to me, "It's not normal, you smell awful." I just smiled and ran my hand down my arm, smelling it as if it were a ritual. "It's natural, Emma, that's what real men smell like." But her face contorted in disgust and she said, "No, David, that's what madness smells like." Her words really hurt, but I couldn't let her see how I felt. She didn't understand what this meant to me. To her, it was just a deodorant that wasn't really a deodorant. But to me, it was a revolution. It was a rejection of synthetic lies and the slavery of chemicals. I loved that earthy, wild scent that emanated from me. It was my manhood, it was freedom. But Emma couldn't see it that way, and little by little she began to distance herself, taking refuge in the guest room at night and avoiding me during the day. This distance felt like a betrayal, as if her lack of support cut deeper than any insult. The apartment became colder without her warmth, and try as I might, I told myself it didn't matter, but I did feel her rejection and lack of understanding very deeply. This was my truth, my identity. The last straw came after a weekend trip we took together. We took the bus, and I noticed how people were looking at us, and the whispers were louder than they thought. Emma was visibly mortified and didn't want to sit next to me on the return trip, choosing a seat at the front instead while I enjoyed my solitude at the back, surrounded by my own air. But when we got home, Emma exploded. "Do you care how humiliating this is?" She threw her bag on the floor with force and reproached me for the fact that people were whispering behind our backs. "I don't care what they think, they're just sheep blind to the truth." "No, David," she interrupted me, her eyes blazing. "You're delusional. It's not about truth or freedom, this is your obsession. You've let this horrible stench that you turned into an affirmation of your manhood without being it at all consume you." Obsession and stench. I couldn't believe she would define me that way. She didn't understand anything. At that moment I stared at her and I realized that the love I once felt began to transform into something darker. "You don't understand, do you?" I said, moving closer. She shuddered, but did not back away. "This smell is me. This is what I am. And if you can't accept that..." She stopped and put her hand on the doorknob, apparently ready to leave. "If you leave, it will mean that maybe you shouldn't be here." She let out a hollow, bitter laugh, and then she uttered the words that defined the future of our relationship. "Yes, maybe I shouldn't be here." That night, I watched her pack. Her movements were abrupt and full of anger, and she didn't speak to me. I didn't stop her, but when she reached the door, I felt something inside me break. I couldn't let her go. I couldn't lose everything because of a scent. "Emma," I said in a low voice, almost a growl, "if you walk out that door, you're making a mistake." She turned to me and her eyes were a mixture of anger and compassion. "The only mistake I made was staying so long," she said. At that moment, something inside me exploded. I don't even remember when it was that I grabbed the lamp, nor the thud of it hitting Emma's head. I only remember the silence that followed, a heavy, oppressive silence that I had never felt before. I stood there, feeling her heavy breathing and noticing how the scent of my deodorant mixed with that metallic scent of blood. It was intoxicating. Emma had been wrong. She was incapable of understanding the truth. But now she was silent. She couldn't insult me. She couldn't undermine my decisions or make me feel small. Now I was truly free. I dragged her body to the bathroom, the only place where my scent could not be overwhelmed by the stench of decomposition. I cleaned the blood carefully, with an eerie calm, and when I finished, I sat in the living room with the deodorant stick in my hand, enjoying her scent, which was my own. This was what it was. This was freedom, and no one, absolutely no one, would ever take it away from me. The world around me became blurred, and those sharp edges were hurting me in every corner of my body. My muscles were exhausted from what had happened the night before, so I put my hand under a tap to wash myself. I hated feeling dirty. It was something I really couldn't bear. The grime would get under my nails and make me feel disgusting. But despite that, I was in one of my happiest moments, as if all that pain was about to disappear. An owl was hooting in the distance, so I leaned out of the window to gaze at the full moon in all its splendor. It was as if it knew all my secrets and was keeping them just for me, and that gave me a strange feeling of joy. I smiled at it, and then I looked at myself in the mirror. But a shiver ran through me when I noticed that it had bloodstains on it. My body ached, and I knew that I had made an effort, but it was for my little boy. I did all this so that he wouldn't suffer anymore. I finished washing myself in a hurry and went back inside, and there was my son. He was fast asleep, oblivious to all the horror that had happened. I thought that it would ruin his peace of mind if he knew the truth about what human beings are capable of. And with those thoughts, I stopped at his door and looked at him, placid with those long eyelashes on his chubby cheeks. He looked like an angel, a little one that I will protect with everything I have, even if it means that he will only have me as a mother. He didn't know it yet, but I was his new mother. After a moment, I returned to my cold bed, where another person had lain just a moment before. That loneliness weighed on me, so I closed my eyes and imagined a perfect world, a place without crime, where people could be happy and where I could have as many children as I wanted. I would look after them, feed them, and take them to the park whenever they wanted, even for ice cream, but not so much that their teeth would get chapped. As I struggled between reality and that ideal world, I fell asleep with the image of Eddie as my son, and the echoes of heart-rending screams resonating in my mind, as if they were coming from the depths of the night. Everything became eerie and silent afterwards. Even the owl stopped hooting, and the outside world seemed to stop, as if the horrendous events of the previous night were calming down, and that sent a chill down my spine. At dawn, the sun shone, promising a new day as Eddie's mother. I got up, opened the drawers in the room, and found beautiful clothes. Dresses that I knew would fit me well and make me look like that perfect and selfless mother I had always wanted to be. I dressed, watching my face in the mirror. I was so pale that I almost looked translucent. So I put on makeup trying to look my best. I even applied a little blush to add color to my cheeks, and then I went downstairs to wake Eddie. "Breakfast will be ready soon," I said to him, humming, as I gently stirred him from his sleep. He still looked sleepy and frowned when he saw me. Then his eyes stopped on what I was wearing, and I gave him a slightly forced smile. "Why are you wearing Mommy's clothes?" he asked, looking at me confused. I frowned but said nothing at first. I thought maybe he was still asleep and didn't know what he was saying. "Darling, I'm your mother. Don't you remember me?" I asked him, although I could see he was still frowning. "Mommy's not supposed to be here. You're not her," he replied. And I decided to ignore what he was saying. He was a child after all, and he had probably forgotten it was only a matter of time. "You've grown so much," I said to him, although in my mind I was surprised at how quickly time had passed. It seems like yesterday when he was a little boy. I told Eddie that I would make him breakfast because I knew how much he liked Fruit Loops. I smiled, but he shook his head as he followed me into the kitchen. "I don't eat Fruit Loops," he said in a serious tone. He looked at me with tired eyes and asked, "Are you my mother?" His question made me smile again, although I felt as if something inside me had broken. Fortunately, it didn't hurt. "Yes, darling, I'm your mom. I'm here to protect you and take care of you," I replied, trying to make him feel confident. "But Dad said you died," Eddie whispered as if he were telling me a secret. That mention of his father made my blood boil. I thought of that man who stabbed me in the heart just because I was planning to do the same to him. I tried not to think about it and tried to concentrate on making the scrambled eggs and the toast. Although it was hard for me to hold anything because everything slipped away from me, but I kept trying until in the end I managed to prepare breakfast. Luckily, Eddie didn't ask any more questions. He just ate in complete silence. I watched him fondly, wanting to absorb every detail of that moment, as the sun shone brightly and filtered through the large kitchen windows. But even so, I felt a deep cold, a feeling I had become accustomed to. Loneliness and cold were my companions, so I let them envelop me while Eddie finished eating. After breakfast, I loaded the dishwasher and then washed my hands with a cloth. It was then that I noticed a knife forgotten on the table, with bloodstains that were not mine. I picked it up to wash it, but then I saw Eddie looking at it with wide eyes without saying a word. I didn't want to explain what had happened and just asked him to leave me alone in the kitchen while I cleaned the dried human blood off the knife. After he left, the images of the previous night came back to me in a flash. Me holding the knife, cutting and burying things. In the midst of these memories, Eddie came in, and I was still holding the knife. "Where's Dad?" he asked, curious. I should have anticipated it. He was a smart kid, so I held the knife so tightly that I felt the blood start to drip down my palm. I had cut myself. "Have you checked the backyard?" I asked him. He nodded, frowning. "It's not there." My lips curved into a smile at that moment, probably looking awful next to my bloody hands. In fact, I dropped the knife in the sink and went to wash my hands. I had a big cut, but I felt no pain. "It's in the backyard," I repeated. "Have you tried digging in the freshly turned soil? It's there and it called to you all night." At that moment, I saw the fear slide into his eyes, and tears began to well up when he realized that he had buried his father alive. I had to understand, I had to. He wouldn't have let me be his mother, so I had to make a decision for his sake to keep him safe. His father had killed his mother once, and here I was, determined not to leave, so I went over to Eddie, who seemed paralyzed, and held his arm firmly. I had to explain the truth to him. "I'm your mother, Eddie. Now I'm also your father. Your father killed your real mother a couple of years ago. She was my twin, and today I killed him. I killed your father so that you would be safe with me. Take my hand, darling. I'm your mother now, and you have to listen to me." I couldn't let Eddie live with a monster capable of murder, so I had to act. But none of this was as terrifying as the look of terror in his eyes. I didn't want him to feel that way, but I knew he would adapt. He had to understand that I was his mother reborn, and that in some way, His dead mother and I were the same. All I wanted was for him to be quiet and for me to observe everything in silence. Eddie was only 4 years old, so he would adapt quickly, and he did. 5 years have passed since then, and he no longer even asks about his father. Over time, I have changed the story until I have made it something much easier for him to digest. In the new reality that I implanted in his little head, his father died of an illness when he was too young to remember it, and now there were only 2 of us, and that's how it has to be. He is now a happy child who loves me and gets good grades. We have a very special relationship, and the memories of that dark past are now well buried. Many years have passed since that time, but the memories are still fresh in my head as if they were burned into my mind. I will never be able to forget my experience in the Tennessee orphanage. I was only 7 years old when they took me away from my home, and the truth is that I don't have a clear image of my mother's face, but I will always remember her muffled scream as they took me away. It was 1946. The placement in that adoption agency in Memphis was a moment I can never erase. My mother was a single mother and worked hard to support us both, and because of that, she would often leave me alone for long periods of time, so I got used to spending hours without company. Although I always suspected that people thought she neglected me, deep down I knew she was just doing what was necessary to make sure we had something to eat. Although we didn't have any luxuries, I loved my mother and appreciated everything she did for me. However, life became hard when she became seriously ill, as she lost her job and our situation quickly worsened. During that time, she managed to use what little she had saved to feed us, but our neighbors, upon learning of our situation, decided that my mother was not capable of taking care of me, and they contacted a local adoption agency. That was how they came to look for me. I will never forget the morning they arrived. It was the first time I saw Mrs. Tammy, the agency's secretary. I hadn't spoken a word to her, but I knew she was a cold and distant woman, and she and other agency workers had conspired against my mother, forcing her to give me up. She resisted, insisting that she would soon recover and be able to return to work, but they told her they couldn't guarantee it, and although I wanted to stay with her, I knew we had no choice. Finally, they tried to convince my mother that it would only be temporary, so she reluctantly agreed. Before they took me away, she asked me to give her a hug, but the workers wouldn't let her come near. I remember shouting and protesting as they dragged me out of our house, and she pleaded with them not to take me away from her, but her voice fell on deaf ears. I fought as hard as I could, but there was nothing I could do as the faces of our neighbors looked at me, thinking they were doing the right thing by calling the agency, when in reality, without knowing it, they were sending me to a place that was like a living hell. The years I spent at the Tennessee Children's Home Society were a torment. My placement, which was supposed to be temporary at first, became permanent, and nobody told me I could return home. In that home, food was scarce, and I was hungry most of the time. The caregivers in charge of us, all white women, were abusive and treated us horribly. I remember one episode in particular. Food was very rationed, and as I was very hungry, I asked for an extra portion. Then they brutally hit me in the face. The pain was so intense that it tore my lip, and I cried for days, but that was just the beginning. Each day was worse than the last, and I prayed every night in the hope of escaping, but I knew it was not very likely. The families that came to adopt generally took the babies, and older children like me were forgotten, so the older children became friends to help us get through those difficult times. That's how I met my friends Katie and Natasha. There were many girls like us in the home, a little older, and we all shared the same feeling of abandonment. So we took care of each other, trying to form a family with the girls around us. With time, we developed our own routines, always keeping an eye on the younger girls, telling each other stories to distract us from the situation. Hope became our refuge, although unfortunately it was not enough to escape the reality of our surroundings. You could say that the brutality of the place and the indifference of the staff brought us even closer together. Together we dreamed of a different future, a place where we would be treated with love and respect. The friendship between us was the only light we had in the darkness of that nightmare. As the nights grew longer and colder, we made promises that one day we would leave, that we would find a place where we could be free, and sometimes we thought about our mothers and the life we had left behind. Hopes of escaping soon became bittersweet, but with each passing day, reality became more difficult to bear. However, neither Katie nor Natasha were willing to give up. They were determined to find a way out of that prison disguised as a home. Although life in the children's home was a real disaster, my friends managed to make the days a little more bearable, and, at least for a while, their friendship and the little things we shared gave me some happiness. But that peace was interrupted when I began to notice strange things happening in the place. I don't know why, but many of the children started to disappear. It was as if they had been swallowed up by the earth, and there was no explanation for it. We all knew they weren't being adopted because in the home, we were always aware of who was leaving. But it wasn't just the older children. Some babies also vanished. But the strange thing was that most of them didn't seem to care, as if they had already resigned themselves or didn't realize what was happening. However, I did notice it. My mother always said that I was very observant, so maybe that made me pay more attention than the others, and honestly, it made me very anxious to see these disappearances. But I couldn't ask questions because I knew that would only get me into trouble. I would probably end up getting beaten up by the staff. Then one day, Katie disappeared. And that was when I realized I couldn't keep quiet anymore. I remember asking Natasha about one of the nurses, a woman everyone in the home feared, called Alice. She had a scar on her face and a ferocious attitude. She always looked at us as if we were a bunch of nasty insects, and on the day I plucked up the courage to approach her, Alice was particularly hurtful. "What happened to Katie?" I asked her, my heart beating a mile a minute. But the first thing she did was to slap me and shout at me, "You damn girl, how dare you talk to me? Don't talk about her here ever again." The truth is that the blow didn't hurt as much as before. In the end, I had developed a kind of resistance to the abuse we suffered. But anyway, I didn't give up. I kept spying on Alice whenever I could, convinced that I had to find out the truth. After a couple of days, I finally saw something. One night, I watched Alice take a package to an empty lot near the home. I couldn't see exactly what she was doing, but it looked to me like she was digging a small hole in the ground, and that intrigued me. So I decided that very night, on May 14th, 1948, I would try to find out what she had hidden. I was only 10 years old, but I managed to sneak out of the house. It was a dark night, but I recognized the place where I had seen Marta digging because there was fresh soil. I didn't have a shovel, so I started digging with my hands, although it was really hard. My fingers hurt from the soil, but I wasn't going to stop. Finally, I reached something at the bottom of the hole. My heart stopped when I saw it was the hand of a child. But as I continued to dig up more earth, my heart began to feel heavier and heavier until I came across the decomposing face of Katie. Some things can scar you forever. And that sight not only left a wound, it broke me inside. I couldn't believe she was the only one. There were other remains there too. Some babies and several other children. Unable to contain the horror, I started screaming at the top of my lungs, and within minutes, Alice and the rest of the staff found me, dragged me back to the home, and told their boss. Alive didn't stop before beating me up and locking me in an isolation room, making sure I would never repeat what I had seen. I screamed for days and lost my voice from doing so. Although I regained my voice later, the image of what I had discovered never left my mind, as well as the betrayal of those people, the loss of my friends, and the horror of what I saw. All of that haunted me, as did the terrifying shadow of the home that should be a refuge. That night changed my life forever. Now I was not only trapped in that place, but I also had to bear a dark secret that threatened to consume everything that was left of me. And every time I saw the nurses, I felt a mixture of fear and anger, and that only made my situation even more unbearable. I promised myself that even though I didn't know how, One day I would find a way to escape from that nightmare. I had to find a way out of that hell. Life in the children's home had become a living hell. Every time I screamed because of what I had seen, Mrs. Libya and Alice sedated me, and sometimes they locked me up, leaving me to starve to death to teach me a lesson. Despite everything, my only living friend, Natasha, always found a way to give me some of her food, although she also had very little. More than anything, I didn't understand how I had managed to survive all that horrible experience, and I could never forget Mrs. Alice's cold eyes when she told me that she could have killed me with her own hands for what I did, but that I was now alive because some clients were interested in adopting older girls. That was the only reason I was still breathing, because my useless life could become a lucrative business. A couple of days passed, and finally I got the news that a couple was interested in adopting a girl between 8 and 13 years old. I had been chosen. I remember they took one look at me and I burst into uncontrollable tears. I begged them not to, that I didn't want to be adopted, that I just wanted to go back to my mother. But then they told me that she had died and that I couldn't go home, that this new family was my only option. That broke my heart, and I cried my eyes out while they cleaned the bruises and prepared me to meet my new family. The last image I have of the Tennessee Children's Home Society is the satisfied look on Mrs. Alice's face as they took me away to start my new life. Fortunately, my adoptive parents, Julian and Rosa, were great. Julian was a wealthy businessman and Rosa, a psychologist who had decided to become a teacher. They quickly noticed that I was traumatized and gave me the care and support I needed. It took some time, but eventually I managed to heal surprisingly just 2 years after being adopted. Although life seemed to have improved, bad news came from Mrs. Alice. It turns out that she was involved in a horrific human trafficking scandal. It came to light that the Children's Home Society had been operating as a kind of adoption camp where the business was stealing children. A journalist discovered that many of us had been unjustly and unnecessarily separated from our families, and in some cases abducted. The children were sold to wealthy families, and during our time in the home, many of us were abused. Grim stories came to light, including about children who had been murdered, and it is estimated that around 5,000 children were stolen, and around 19 were officially reported as dead due to the abuse they suffered. The scandal was so great that an investigation was launched in September 1950, which led to the closure of the Home Society. But all this came to light after Mrs. Alice fell ill with cancer and died just 3 days before she was arrested. I was a child when all this happened, so I didn't fully understand the horror. But as I grew up, I started to investigate and understood that she used the agency as a clandestine adoption business. I found out that, luckily, I had been placed with a good family, as I heard that some of the other children were given to abusive families or used as cheap labor on farms. Reliving those memories was painful, but I managed to get through it when I turned 20. Then I decided it was time to look for my birth mother, and I soon discovered that everything I had been told about her death was not true. In fact, she had been searching for me with all her might. She had only died 3 years ago. Although I love my adoptive parents, I regret not having had the opportunity to hug my mother and tell her how much I loved and missed her. Today I am married to a wonderful man with whom I have a daughter, and although many years have passed, I know that I can never forget my time in the Tennessee Children's Home Society. The scandal surrounding the agency resulted in reforms to Tennessee's adoption laws, which made me very happy. Nobody deserves what I went through. Sometimes I think about my friend Natasha and wonder what has become of her. I sincerely hope she was able to survive that horrible place. I feel like she is out there somewhere, and I sincerely hope she has managed to have a happy ending like mine. Everything you have just heard is part of the story that I took from the diary of my mother, the lady, who is now 85 years old and as strong as ever. Since I was little, she would take me to the monument for the victims of the Tennessee Children's Home Society, but I didn't understand why until I read her story. I am relieved that she was able to survive, so I decided to share her experience to raise awareness about the horrible events that took place in that adoption agency. We need to remember that our children are the future, and it is essential to take the best possible care of them. It is also important for people to know that no one can be trusted when it comes to the safety of children, not even established institutions, and that these should always be subject to supervision for the sake of the little ones. Evil psychopaths like Mrs. Alice are everywhere, and sometimes these places provide them with a perfect lair to do their misdeeds in complete impunity. When I was around 11 years old, my family decided to move to a new house in Los Angeles. It was nothing special, just a one-story house that seemed perfect for the three of us. I attended a private school in the city, and to be honest, I was always a bit socially awkward, which is important for this story. I also have autism, so making friends and relating to others was a constant challenge. My parents knew this and tried to help me with therapy and medication, but nothing really worked. We moved to California because my dad got a new job that paid him better, which meant he was away from home most of the time. My mom also worked, so sometimes we had to find a babysitter, and the babysitter I adored had moved more than 3,000 kilometers away looking for better opportunities. And that made me sad. We had to find someone new to take care of me. Finally, my mom found Luna, a 19-year-old girl who seemed friendly. At first, she seemed like a good choice, but I started to notice some strange things during her first weeks with us. They were minor details, like little spasms and concentration problems. However, those problems began to become more evident. Suddenly, she would talk to herself or ask me strange questions, and sometimes I felt a little sorry for her, although I didn't know exactly what was going on. The first night I met Luna was when my parents were celebrating their anniversary. I remember that she came to look after me, and I didn't interact much with her, although I tried to be nice, and I remember we had a good time. However, when it came to sleeping, it was a bit complicated, so in the end, I ended up going to bed. Looking back, I think I slept for several hours before anything strange happened. I woke up, and as if it were a breeze, I heard the door to my room open, but I paid no attention and went back to sleep. However, later on, I felt the door open a little more and saw someone standing in the corner of my room. At first, I couldn't make out who it was, but as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw that it was Luna, standing there by my bed. At that moment, I turned on the bedside lamp and she started to apologize. She explained to me that she tends to sleepwalk. But what really disturbed me was that she was holding something in her hand, one of my dad's electric drills, but this one had no battery. Luna started giving me complicated excuses about why she was there with that tool, but at only 11 years old, I already had a bad feeling about it. However, at that moment, I didn't see her as a real threat. Later, when my parents returned home, I told them what had happened and they went crazy. They tried to call Luna, but there was no answer. My mother also noticed that some empty prescription bottles were missing, but Luna denied any wrongdoing, and although the police were informed, they couldn't do anything, as she hadn't committed a crime either. So it all remained a no-brainer that I still don't fully understand. After that night, Luna never looked after me again, and I really hope I never hear from her again. I still have moments when I wonder what she was planning to do with that drill. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night with the distressing feeling that she is there, at the edge of my bed. The truth is that, although my parents tried to calm me down, that experience always left a mark that was difficult to erase. Although years have passed, I cannot forget what happened that night. I always wonder if she was just an unstable girl or if there was something darker to her behavior. The uncertainty of not knowing what she was really going to do is something that haunts me sometimes.